1998 saw the release of critically acclaimed manga such as Hunter x Hunter, Vagabond, and Fruits Basket. However, once you skim off that top layer, you begin to see the true depths of mediocrity, and that's precisely what I want to highlight in today's manga spotlight. A true, unfiltered look into the manga of 1998. The first manga I'd like to talk about is Apocalypse Meow by Motofumi Kobayashi, a manga that ran for 29 chapters across 4 volumes in SoftBank Publishing's GameSpot magazine. The premise is simple. Imagine the Vietnam War if it was fought by cats and rabbits. That's Apocalypse Meow, and yes, this is exactly the reference you think it is. Now, as a historical manga, there are certain pros and cons inherent to this style of writing, and I think I'd like to discuss a few of them as they apply to Apocalypse Meow. First and foremost, with respect to the pros, you can really appreciate the mangaka's expertise on the subject. I mean, the technical vocab is there, with lots of footnotes explaining military jargon. Kobayashi seems particularly well read on the more strategic aspect of combat, so we get a lot of detailed accounts of various offensive and defensive tactics, right? There are even instances where we get a map and the kind of different troops and their attacks are kind of plotted. Really thoughtful stuff, and as far as I can tell, generally pretty historically accurate. That aside, there's some praise to be had on the visual side as well. We can see the way the manga conveys texture through its art is pretty impressive. Especially in some of the backgrounds, we can see the way shadows are cross-hatched and how that communicates a certain texture with ample depth. Or even the line work on some of the animals, the way it details the fur, its direction, its texture. Again, this is something that not a lot of manga are successful at, but Kobayashi seems to be very fluent and proficient in communicating texture through art. Unfortunately, that's where my praise ends, as there are more negative things to say than positive. For one, as a general reader, having to constantly divert my eyes to the bottom of the page for extra info does interrupt the flow of the story quite a bit, stopping me from getting more immersed. And no, this is not a case of shonen fans can't read. Listen, motherfucker, I did my master's in philosophy, so I'm well acquainted with books that have more footnotes than pages. Now, obviously, I understand that the technical vocab helps facilitate a more historically accurate setting, and so for the more well-informed, that yields a more immersive experience. But there's gotta be a better balance between maintaining that historical accuracy, but also creating a seamless reading experience for a general audience, because let's face it, you had to run a survey on the general manga reading demographic. What percentage of those people do you think is extremely knowledgeable on the Vietnam War, where the footnotes may only be a suggestion and not necessarily something you must read? I reckon that portion is very small, so maybe next time keep that general audience in mind, keep the 99% of people in mind when you're writing a manga. But even on that historical side, there's lots to criticize, because if you read this manga, it's got a pretty clear pro-American bias. And I mean, just think about how it's set up from the get-go. We have these cute little rabbits, the brave warriors, that fight against these cruel cats. Now, can you just guess which ones are the Americans and which the Vietnamese? So although I can appreciate it as something of a passion project, once you strip back the historical details, you're just left with a cheesy war manga. A furry reskin of the Vietnam War strung together by American war hero film cliches. But hey, maybe as a object of study for a certain subsect of Japan's perception of the Vietnam War, it might be interesting if you've got that kind of angle and if you can spin it that way. I can't, I won't, but you could. The next manga I want to talk about is That's a Bit Much Kikuchi. For the uninitiated, this was a one-shot published in Big Comic Spirits on June 1st, 1998, by none other than Inyo Asano. Immediately, one thing I want to highlight with respect to this manga is the somewhat unique circumstances under which it was published. So originally, in this edition of Big Comic Spirits, this slot was supposed to be filled out entirely by a one-shot by Naoki Yamamoto. However, when Yamamoto presented his editor with that manga, it ended up being a little too short, and so Asano, who was, I believe, 17 at the time, who was talking with Yamamoto's editor, ended up getting this one-shot published to fill in the remaining space. Now, what exactly is this manga about? Well, it's pretty short. We can practically read it together in this video. We see a girl coming to a boys' school. Some boy speaks out about it, which perhaps suggests that the teachers or the faculty are unaware that she's a girl. Anyways, so the girl then kicks the teacher in the balls? Then fast forward to the next day, all the students are now suddenly dressed up as girls. We see the teacher embrace them and then sticks his head up his own ass. Okay, wow. Am I stupid? Like what did I just read? Like, what's the gag? Genuinely, I can't make much of this at all. And even Asano himself somewhat is shocked that this got published. I have a quote here where he said, "When I asked my editor about it later, he claimed to have felt some sort of diamond in the rough potential in it. But maybe he was just drunk when he said that, because I can't say I feel too much potential in looking at it now." Wow, I mean, that speaks volumes. But I think that most artists probably look back on their earlier works with somewhat of a sort of regretful eye. But regardless, my challenge to you today is, in the comments, give me your best stab at an interpretation, and feel free to take it along two paths here. On the one hand, if you can make sense of what is literally going on here, I mean, already props to you, but if you can pull out some kind of thematic core, if you can enlighten us about the messages manga is trying to communicate, what is the gag? Elucidate any of that for a chance to win nothing. But really, I've mainly highlighted this for its importance. This is where the great Asano got his start, and it's interesting to see how different his roots are to where he ended up. I mean, this is really just like a surreal gag manga. If I were to tell you that the mangaka behind Goodnight Punpun started with this, you'd never believe me. Finally, the last manga I want to talk about today is Slu Girl. Okay. Now, this one might be a bit of a nostalgic reminder to some, as it floated around the English web back in the early 2000s, on sites like Newgrounds and the such. This manga was written by Isutoshi. Sorry, that sounds extremely unnatural. You might have inferred from past videos that I'm not Japanese. And I'm kind of cheating with this one, I gotta say, because it did serialize, I think, strictly speaking, starting in the late 1997, but it did serialize across most of 1998. I think the bulk of its serialization was in 1998 in Comic Penguin Club, and then the tankobon was released in 1999. But it's awfully convenient for me to say this was in 1998 because I want to talk about it, and this is a video about 1998. The summary is something like this. The story follows Sayoko Bizen, the girl for whom the manga is named after, and her various schemes to get rich, essentially. A lot of the manga is anchored by her relationship with Satoru Ichi, who's, basically a total pushover, but he happens to gratify her every sexual desire. Now, straight up, this is fundamentally a hentai. But, importantly, and that's why it's in this video, there's an equal emphasis placed on the comedic aspect of the relationship, making this more than just good goons. Now, really, I think this manga distinguishes itself on two fronts. For one, there's the content. As a hentai, there's none of that, freak shit you might expect from most hentai. If you've got any preconceptions or you've got any kind of stereotypical understandings of what a hentai might be, that's not it here. I mean, what we get is some pretty vanilla sex between a couple of adults. So, I mean, on that front, that makes it a little more palatable to a general audience. Let me just say that. Now, more importantly, and this again is really why it's being mentioned at all here, the characters, they're not just empty vessels to facilitate sex scenes, right? The mangaka was careful to imbue each character with their own unique personality, and I genuinely believe that this manifests in the most mundane panel-to-panel action. Many claim that this was a revolutionary manga, as it was the first to really popularize a more plot-focused structure in this genre, we might say, especially one in which comedy played a central role. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still a hentai first and foremost. However, what you really gotta appreciate is how the first few chapters really tried to use sex to fulfill some comedic purpose. And I thought it was done well enough. It's not exactly your thinking man's comedy, but it did have this charm by virtue of its crassness, which frankly, I mean, it got some good chuckles out of me. Now, by the second half, a lot of these interactions were kind of reduced to, geez, I'm horny, let's have sex. By that point, a lot of the comedy was then delegated to kind of miscellaneous remarks and conversations. It kind of seemed like an afterthought. By then, at least, the quality of the sex scenes would improve. But I mean, frankly, if you're reading this for just the sex, you're better off reading something else. I mean, again, what I thought made this manga so interesting was how it used sex to facilitate comedic scenes, how it would provoke a comedic reaction out of the reader. Assuming they can appreciate or get behind this kind of crass style of humor, because again, it's not your thinking man's humor. You know, for those who appreciate highbrow humor, I don't know if I'd ask you to stop here, but for the more cultured of us, I reckon this is worth a stop. I mean, six chapters? What are you losing? What are you losing over 6 chapters? But anyways, that more or less covers the manga I wanted to discuss today. This true, unfiltered look into 1998. But let me end you on this thought. Do you want to really know why 1998 was the worst year for manga? Because it's the year I was born, and I've been ruining manga discourse ever since. Need proof? Just subscribe now, and you'll get to see more awful takes like the ones presented in this video every month. My name is Doofy, and thank you for watching.